So everything we've talked about so far has mostly been wintering grounds and food sources and that stuff, but we can't have any of that unless we have breeding grounds and we have ducks making baby ducks in Canada. That's where you, Dr. Dames, come in, and we want to talk about, your experience. You've lived your life on the prairie and seen where we've come, and what's going on in Canada right now. I mean, where are we at, do you think, in condition today versus where we were 10, 20, 30 years ago on prairie conditions?
Well, there's a few things we know and we're certain of. One is we've got rid of 75% of the prairie. It's now growing annual crops. So in terms of breeding habitat, we know we've lost. And most of that is the better soils with the higher wetland density areas too. The areas that are left in grassland or native prairie, most of those areas are not high wetland density. Some of them are good waterfowl production areas, but a lot of them just don't have the wetland density and the duck holding capacity and density that there is on the better soils, which are all being farmed now. So that's very clear. We know we've lost.
You said 75%?
75% of the
Prairie has been converted to agriculture.
Now annual cropland, yeah.
So we talked about, keep saying economic drivers, I think I'd love for you to allude to was that in the early 2000s we had mad cow disease. And most people as duck hunters are like, what does that have to do with ducks? But that actually played a big role in converting the prairie to agriculture. Why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Well, they found one in Canada in 2003. We actually export about 40% of our cattle out of the country, and 75% of that comes to the US. Well, as soon as you found out we got mad cow, which is very appropriate, shut the border down, and up to 40 other countries also said, we don't want your beef, Canada. It can spread. That's a dangerous disease. We don't want that stuff around. So it hit the beef market really, really hard. The price dropped by 2/3 when that happened. The ranchers that were out there with the cattle didn't even sell their cattle. They just held on. There was no market. They weren't worth anything. So we've lost cattle, which is a bad thing because you might suspect we're going to lose grassland and prairie, which is a bad thing from a duck perspective. It didn't translate that way so far, so they didn't immediately go and start putting that 20% of land that the cattle used to be on into crop production. Yeah, they're nibbling away as they always have at the amount of native prairie and converting it to annual cropland. But it didn't result in 20% drop immediately. So that's sort of the good news.
So when the conversion away from cattle happened, what did you actually move into? Was it a transition into, wasn't it winter wheat or something? How did that all play a role, and how does that relate to duck production?
Yeah, so as I said, we didn't lose when the cattle herd dropped. Basically, the stocking rate went down. People held on to their cattle for a couple of years till the price came back and started to sell it. We've now dropped about 20% of our cattle herd, but we haven't lost 20% of the habitat. On the cropland, we're always increasing our cropland slightly. And a lot of that's occurred at the forest line, so the majority of increased cropland in Canada along the Boreal forest, people are knocking down trees and turning cattle out there, trying to grow some annual crop. So the annual cropping, our biggest point of optimism was on all the 75% of the land on the Canadian prairies is now annually cropped. What can we do there? Whether you're growing canola or wheat or barley, whatever. And there's been a lot of changes in the last few decades. Canola wasn't around 20, 30 years ago hardly, and now it's a major crop.
So the timing of planting, whether it's winter wheat or canola, how does that affect a breeding duck, a duck that comes to Canada, the timing of the plowing and all that?
Yeah.
What's the relationship there?
Well, if we go back 30, 40 years, there used to be a lot of fallow land. I don't know if people were aware of that, but people used to not farm their cropland every second year because it built up. The idea was from the 30s and 40s, you build up the organic matter and build up the soil and be much more productive. So almost half of the land sometimes was left in fallow. They till it though, so if a duck decided to try to nest in that dirt, they go and till it to keep the weeds down. That practice is virtually dead and gone on the prairie, so it's annual cropping now all over. And our biggest point of optimism was these fall seeded crops. Surprisingly, you put wheat or rye in the ground in the fall and let that green up early in the spring. It provided fabulous cover for ducks eventually, but the nest success was as good as we've ever found. So it was fabulous nesting success in these fall seeded crops. So the conservation community jumped on winter wheat in particular, and there's new varieties being made. At some point, winter wheat that you plant in the fall susceptible to diseases and that sort of thing. It's not the same quality as a spring seeded wheat. So that we were looking to that as maybe affecting a lot of acres. We built it up to 1.5 million acres of winter wheat. It was fabulous. In the last 10 years, it dropped. The bottom just dropped out of winter wheat. So they're not doing it anymore. There's still, I think, 250,000 acres, but it used to be 1.5 million. So the winter wheat acreage has just plummeted. That's not good news because it's fabulous waterfowl nesting cover from a nesting success point of view. Point of optimism, fall rye has started to take off. Now it hasn't taken off to the point of getting to 1.5 million acres, but it's been doubling in the last year or two. So fall rye is starting to come up. Winter wheat has dropped precipitously. So there's some optimism in fall rye. They're working again on new varieties of fall rye. So keep drinking rye whiskey. That's a point of optimism. I'd say, how do you affect cropland? There's one of the few crops we know good for ducks, and that one's starting to go up. So that's
and when we talk about putting the prairie in perspective, you're talking crops, but we're not talking food sources here. We're talking cover for nesting. Nesting cover is going to be key to having a successful breeding season in Canada. And so obviously, as well as we've had changes on the south end of the flyway, quite a few changes. 2003 with mad cow, we're only looking in the last 20 years of, you've mentioned almost 3 different crops have evolutionized and things have changed, and getting back to some crazy things that happen politically, but yet the indirect effects all go back to who's buying a crop, what crop's being produced, and that all relates to cover for ducks. Who would have thought that all this world political stuff can have an effect on whether a duck can produce a nest or not?
And one of the things we've learned in the last couple of decades is how important on a landscape level the amount of, call it herbaceous or perennial cover. That can be native prairie, it could be seeded prairie for grassland ranching, it can be planted cover for ducks, it can be hayland, but it's not annually tilled, and that's the secret. And you get lots of that on the landscape, you start getting 20% of the duck nest hatching instead of 5 to 10% of the duck nest hatching. So we've learned that both with CRP lands in the North Central states. They've proved it in Canada now too. Having more perennial cover on the land is a wonderful thing. So we'd like to see more grassland, more cows would be a good thing from a duck perspective.
So, we've talked about the challenges in agriculture that you're seeing with cover, but one of the things that we've kind of left out that's a big deal is water. Where we're at, droughts are big deals and that kind of stuff. So how important is water on the prairie?
It's magic. It's magic on the prairies. Going back to what we talked about, some old folks being around, like John Lynch talked about, just add water. It's true. We've learned when you just add water, not only are the ducks attracted there, nest success goes up, especially when you're transitioning from a dry year to a wet year. And we believe it's probably because we're swamping the predators. So those skunks, they're not much to eat in that dry year. They're having trouble, and then all of a sudden, boom, it gets wet. The ducks get attracted. It does great for all the mice as well. The voles, they're doing well in a good wet year. The whole primary productivity, the prairies come up, and so we think that's what's going on. The nest success goes bang through the roof, especially following a drought.
Dave, what are some of the climate change models of course, we talked about in the United States, implied certain things going forward? What's the modeling show for Prairie Canada or the parklands of Canada or other things look in the future? Is it going to get wetter? Is it going to get drier? Do we have any idea? And what will that mean for wetlands and crops?
Yeah, it's more extremes is what they're generally predicting. So the droughts will be worse, but the wet years might be wetter. And we've had some Saskatchewan in the last decade has had 2 years where they needed federal disaster assistance due to flooding. Too much water in the landscape. People couldn't get out and seed their croplands. So whether that's climate change effect we're seeing, possibly, but certainly it's been very wet in Saskatchewan. 2 of the last 10 years to the point where they needed help. Farmers were in trouble. There's still a lot of issues in Saskatchewan trying to get water off the land due to abnormal flooding.
We're talking multiple countries here. We're not just talking a couple states, and so where all of our ducks go back and breed and lay their eggs, you got a whole other system of regulations that we're not even familiar with that they're having to deal with. So it's interesting to hear their perspective on what's going on in the landscape. And while we're on the subject of breeding grounds, I want to get Paul in on this because you're actually from North Dakota. And you can't discount North Dakota and South Dakota for breeding ducks. And some of your research is showing that there's a lot of our mileage that may not even go into Canada potentially. Tell us a little bit about what's going on in North Dakota and South Dakota.
Well, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but wetland loss, in the last 20 years since I've left North Dakota and just periodically get back in the fall to recreate, it's a totally different landscape. I grew up in the 80s and 90s up there. It was small grains, it was rotations, there was fallow. There were a lot of mixed operations up there with small grains and cattle, and the composition has changed a lot in 20 years where it's, row crops now. A lot of areas, especially in the eastern Dakotas, there is no more, wheat, no more peas and lentils and the wide variety, of crops. It's soybeans and corn, and a lot of wetland loss as well. Larry and I have had a lot of conversations over the years, but there's a whole generation of farmers that seem to forget drought. It's been a 20-year wet cycle up there, and farmers have forgotten or seemingly forgotten in a lot of areas that little wetland basin is a good place, to get a crop in a drought year, or a good place to, cut hay in the summer. And there's a lot of folks that are working around wetland, delineations. Ring tiling is a big thing that's become more and more prevalent up there, where they're trapping the water before it has a chance to get into the basin, so they're not making any violations, but they're keeping the water from catching in the basin. So they're not going in and open ditching a wetland, but they can ring tile it and keep all the precipitation and runoff from making it into a basin. It's just a different landscape up there. The equipment, has gotten so much larger just in the last 20 years. What used to be, people planted tree rows, people that grew up through the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, tree rows were a big thing. There were fall cover crops that would go on, to prevent blowing snow in the winter off hilltops and everything. I've watched it in the last few years up there that now hilltops that farmers used to put rock piles on, to reduce their input costs for trying to fight and raise a crop on that hilltop. Now that hilltop is so valuable that they're actually moving their rock piles. They're burying their rock piles so they can farm that quarter acre on the hilltop. And a lot of that is advancements in agriculture technology, precision farming, where they can actually pull a crop off, in a lot of marginal areas now.
Yeah, and we keep going back to the word economic drivers, and I was emailed, here's a report right here from Olim and Robinson. It says that the title of it is Grass to Grain Probabilistic Modeling of Agriculture Conversion in the North American Great Plains. And the 2 states it focuses on, it's North Dakota and South Dakota. And it basically says in a period from 2006, and this is from some of that aerial imagery stuff that you talk about, this technology, from 2006 to 2011, in those 2 states, there's been over 90,000 acres of grassland prairie converted to agriculture in just South Dakota and North Dakota alone. So, and
that was back to that number I had, that the amount of corn acreage, as an example, in North and South Dakota has increased 4.5 million acres in those 2 states alone in the last 15 years or so.
Before we wrap up our conditions, is there any statements or things you want to say about Canada and kind of a wrap up of where we're at? Obviously, y'all have basically the same challenges we do in the United States when you look at it, and it keeps going back to these economic drivers of what a farmer can make money, and all of that impacts ducks and cover. And so those are all stuff that are not related to weather. Weather's a whole other factor that we can't control. We have absolutely no control over weather. And so you've got a lot of issues up there. There's, as you said, there's some good things that are coming out of this. But from a duck hunter down here in Louisiana, I think it's been very informative as what you've told us, because we don't really realize what happens above the border. And we hear the stories and we hear reports, but you actually live it and see it.
Yeah, you can, one of the most widely cited wetland loss figures was 60 to 70% from Prairie, Canada. And it's an old study from Manitoba, and they studied the area because it was phenomenal wetland loss, and that's why they published the paper on it. I can show you areas that have lost 60 to 80%, and I can show you areas where there's no loss, and I can show you areas where there's a slight increase. It's at 3% per decade from the recent study, which very interestingly was the same rate of loss that two other old studies in the Canadian prairies did between the 40s and 70s, one from the 40s and 80s, and I was involved in that one. So the loss has been very consistent for 8 decades now, since the 40s. 3% a year we're losing in terms of number of wetlands. And the amazing thing, maybe it's good news, it hasn't gone up a lot. Tractors are bigger. The economics papers are still telling farmers you can make more money, and it's a nuisance taking that big tractor to go around that edge, and you gotta shut off the cedar and going over fertilize and blah, blah. So the nuisance factor and the economic factors are real drivers for a farmer. Says, I wish I had a nice square field. Wish I had a nice square field. One of the things I don't know if a lot of people are aware of, there was a nice system of federal pastures. They were called the PFRA pastures. It happened as a result of the dirty 30s. The soils were blowing. Farmers left the land. They had tried to farm it. Dirty 30s came in. Soils were blowing. The federal government took over a lot of these lands, and mostly in Saskatchewan. And there was some fabulous duck habitat, and some of it's really good duck habitat. We had a new government, federal government came in and said, these are losers, we're not making money on these. And in fact, they never owned these properties. They were under long-term lease from the province of Saskatchewan. The new federal government came in about 5 years ago and said, it costs us money to run those darn things. They were losing about 30% of what it cost. They put range riders on there. And these pastures, not only were there big chunks of native prairie, they were managed carefully. Because they're under the federal government, they weren't overgrazed, so they were in better condition, more grass on them, less invasive species on them than private pastures. Because the government said, oh, you're overstocking, you better be careful, we're gonna manage it, and they controlled how many cows were put out there. Well, the new government came in and said, well, they're money losers, you wanna get rid of them, and what the government doing is sort of playing around in the private arena anyways. So the federal government walked away, the pastures reverted to the province of Saskatchewan. They said, we're gonna sell them. Highest bidder coming ahead of it. The whole, mainly the conservation community, and not just waterfowl, from other people, just like grassland birds that have also gone down a lot. They all rallied together and they lobbied the provincial government of Saskatchewan and said, man, if you're gonna sell those things, the worst thing that could happen is they get tilled up from a wildlife perspective. Please don't let that happen. They were successful. So the government put them up for sale. Most people couldn't afford them. So the government had to hold on to them in the end. They didn't have a good high bidder. And the province is now running them with a small conglomeration of ranchers, letting them graze their cattle on them. And there's a caveat on these: thou shalt not break the soil, thou shalt not drain any wetlands on them if they do become sold in the future. So that's a real success story in just the last 5-10 years in Saskatchewan. It was the biggest threat to the waterfowl and to grassland habitats in the last while. And so that's a good news story, a very successful story.
Dave, what about the farther we focus on the prairies, and everybody understands the boom and bust importance of the prairies, but the honest truth is that the parklands and the boreal forest produce a huge number. We talked all about mallards and stuff, but think about widgeon, green-winged teal, scaup, ringnecks. A lot of species are obviously important to Louisiana and other places that are really maybe a little less dependent on the prairie. And even mallards, you know, a lot of mallards will breed even farther north, almost the boreal forest and so forth. A lot of people don't understand that. What's your perspective on what's going on in the boreal forest and the parkland areas and those areas?
That's one of the, I think, the new pieces of information that they've come out from surveys. Ducks Unlimited and other organizations have now highlighted how important the western boreal forest is. So when I refer to prairies, I refer to the prairies and the parklands. So that 3% per decade loss of wetlands and 75% of the grassland gone. That's the prairies and the parkland. The Boreal forest, we've learned now, as you point out, it's quite a rich area for breeding waterfowl, particularly the western Boreal forest. It's a little less rocky. It's not the shield country, as we call it, where it's got decent soils underneath the western Boreal, so it's a more productive system. And it's home to a lot of ducks and producing a lot of ducks. And we now have a better notion of how many are up there. So it's now become important. We recognize its importance. I guess it was always important. And some of the North American waterfowl efforts have now expanded to say we better include that now. We know how important that is. So there's not large threats. Yes, there's oil and gas and roads, and yes, there's forestry, but yes, there's huge forest fires that are going to happen whether we like it or not and change that landscape. But it's quite intact compared to the prairie.
And I'm told that, is it true that the Boreal forest is not impacted by drought as much as the prairie?
True.
So the water's pretty much a give me there. It's always constant. So I've been told at times that when the prairie's in a drought, some of those birds can potentially move up and go ahead and breed up there. Is that
Yeah,
true?
the water is not stable. The water is much less variable wetland conditions in the Boreal forest. So on the prairies, when you think about the loss that we've had of 3% of wetlands per decade for 80 years, so it equates to something like losing your 20% of your wetlands over 80 years, and there was drainage before that. The conditions in the Boreal forest are much more stable, and the loss that we see in the prairies of parkland of Canada gets swamped because in a dry year we're down to 1 million ponds. In a wet year we're up to 5 million, so maybe we would have been up to 6 million before, but still that huge difference, a change of 400% difference, 500% difference gets swamped by the loss. So that's why I think the ducks are in pretty good shape sometimes. A bit of a message from my perspective would be we're still suffering from wetland losses in Prairie Canada. We're still suffering from loss of native prairie and grassland. So support for the North American Waterfowl Management Plan and conservation agencies doing work. It's a good thing. Fall rye, let's hope it takes off. Drink rye whiskey. That might help. And eat beef.
Yeah. Sounds good to me.